because I'm going to talk about WinSCP and the artifacts related to it. Now, WinSCP is not something that's new by any means, but there have been some recent changes in Windows 10. I think we might start seeing this leveraged in a different way than we typically have in the past. So just a little bit of background information about myself. My name is Mary DeGrazia. You can reach me at my Twitter handle right there. I am a SANS instructor where I teach Windows forensic analysis. I'm also an associate managing director at Kroll Cyber Security. And of course, back in the 90s, I was sporting some permed hair. So I have the questions window open, and I just kind of wanted to throw this. I think by default, my picture might be on top. So if you're looking down at these 3 pictures of this permed hair, I'm just curious how many of you can actually guess which one of those is me. 1, 2, or 3. So this is back in the 90s.
Mary, sorry, this is Carol. We're still seeing the title slide.
Oh, that's right. It's paused. Okay. There we go. All right.
Wow, those are great.
There we go. Okay, right? How could we miss these pictures? All right. Thank you for telling me that. So my screen's ready. That was the first test. We passed it. Okay, so 1, 2, or 3. One of these is me just rocking the permed hair here for prom. So I see some people putting up 2. So you are correct if you guessed 2. 3 over there is from another movie in the 90s, Legally Blonde. I don't know if you remember that. And 1 is just some random stranger on the internet who was just totally kicking that permed hair. So here we go. We are going to dive in and talk about WinSCP in the 90s theme. So does anybody recognize what movie this is from? A little bit before the 90s, but I just had to give some love to this particular movie, because when we start thinking about remote access into systems, I think this is one of the first ones that did it. War Games, yes, absolutely right. I watched this a few weeks ago and just loved it. If you haven't seen it in a while, it's a good trip down memory lane. But typically when we think about remote access into systems or attackers moving laterally throughout the environment, it's usually done with RDP. And when we think about the artifacts that RDP leaves behind as forensic investigators, you know, we get our shell bags, they're interacting with the system through the Windows Explorer shell. So we get our shell bags, we get our jump lists, we get a bunch of artifacts associated with RDP. So when we're going to take a look at WinSCP in a minute here, you're going to see there's another way that attackers can actually move laterally throughout the environment. Traditionally, when we thought about WinSCP, we think of it a way like an attacker may put it on a system and, you know, take data out of the environment. They're exfiltrating out the data. But with some recent changes with Windows 10, there are some mechanisms they can now leverage to maybe use WinSCP to traverse more laterally and more easily throughout the environment without leaving all the artifacts behind that we get as examiners if they're using something like RDP. So WinSCP, let's take a step back and talk a little bit about WinSCP, what it is and what it does. Basically, WinSCP is SFTP. It's a way that you can transfer files back and forth between systems. So I like to work with a lot of Raspberry Pi projects, and an easy way for me to connect in from like my Windows system to the Raspberry Pi is by using something called WinSCP. I can upload files, I can download files, you can see in the screenshot here, I can even find files. So let's kind of take a look and see what this looks like. So the application I'm going to be focusing on today is really the portable version of WinSCP. So when we think about an attacker inside of an environment, they really want to leave a small footprint. So instead of installing something on the system, WinSCP actually has a portable version. You can go and you can download this. And the nice thing is, from an attacker's perspective, is that everything is done, you know, in one folder. You're not running through an MSI installer. You're not installing an application. on the system. You just get to unzip it from a file and everything's right there. If you think, and I'll actually talk about this a little bit later, a lot of the forensic research out there associated with WinSCP right now has to do with the entries made in the registry. Well, because this is the portable version, we don't get those entries in the registry. So I'm going to go ahead and launch WinSCP. And I actually have another system over here that I will be connecting into. I have it kind of over on, just so you can see it right here, I have it over on another, oh no, everything disappeared. All right, okay, calm down. It's all right, 2020, we can handle this. We can handle this. Okay, good, everything's back. All right, so what we're going to do is connect into the other system that I just showed you. So in this scenario, imagine that I'm an attacker. I've already compromised the environment, which, as we know, happens all the time. I'm on my staging system, and now I want to start to connect out into other systems within the environment to start to look for things. A lot of the ransomware cases that we're working nowadays, this is a big thing that the attackers are doing. They want to push out their ransomware, and in addition, a lot of times they're also looking for data that they can exfiltrate out of the environment, maybe like tax information, W-2s, things of that nature. So I am going to connect into another system on a network. So at this point in time, they've already done the reconnaissance. Maybe they've already ran, their network scanners. They've gotten IP addresses and additional systems that they can log into. So I'm going to log in remotely to another system. And let's see, what is the username and password that I compromised? And it is going, oh, I remember what it is. Let's see if anybody gets this reference. Does anybody recognize that username right there? What movie that's from? Okay, so as I connect in, you'll see I'm going to cache this key, and now I've connected into another system on the network with the crash override account. So once I've connected into another system, now if you think about traditionally using RDP, same type of thing. I can start to click through, look for documents, copy things over back to kind of my staging system. Well, I can absolutely do the same thing here too with WinSCP. So I can go into a documents folder and say like, oh, what's some cool stuff in here? Okay, I've got this IP information. I might want to take that back. It's not unusual to see attackers make different folders on the system to exfiltrate out data. I can download it, pop into this top secret folder, do the same thing, maybe stick it into another folder. I'm going to go ahead and download it. The other thing that I can do as an attacker is I can actually run searches as well. So when we think about RDP, and running searches on a system, we might get an artifact in the registry like the word will query. And this is something that we're seeing in a lot of our investigations too. If they're using a mechanism like RDP to connect into a system and run searches for taxes or W-2s or social security numbers, we get to see that in the word will query. So if they're using WinSCP, they have a mechanism now where they can actually search for file names. So maybe I can do something like SSN, and I can run a search for social security numbers. Maybe I can do something like W2 and look for file names with W2. And then once I get them, I can just click on them and download them. Now, as I'm going along, I want you to take notice of a couple of things. Some of these file paths, there's these drop-down boxes that start storing this information. And in a few minutes here, I'm going to show you the files that actually store this. So as examiners, you can find this information. So the cool thing about WinSCP is now it kind of gives the attackers a way to interact with the system like they would RDP, but leaving less of those artifacts behind. So another thing that we see them do all the time is they'll have a staging system, and on that staging system, they will, push out malware from that staging system to other systems in kind of a manual process. So here, I'm just actually going to upload this, and I'm going to push out that malware to another system, and then maybe use something like PSExec in the background to go ahead and execute that and launch that. Now, when I'm done, doing my bidding as an attacker, I can terminate the session. And now it prompts me, do you want to close without saving a workspace? And since I'm an attacker and I want to leave a small footprint, I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I do not want to save anything. I want to leave the smallest footprint that I absolutely can. Now, the file that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes that has a lot of the really good stuff is this INI file that was created, WinSCP.ini. And I kind of want you to take a look at these timestamps. This file was actually not in here when I first launched WinSCP. That was created the first time that I launched WinSCP, and it's subsequently modified each time that I use it. So in a few minutes here, we're going to dive into that .ini file and talk about all the goodies that we can find with it. So hopping back into the presentation right here. Okay, so did anybody get that reference to Crash Override? What movie that was? If you know, put it in the question box. Old movie, one of the originals that actually had Angelina Jolie in it, if that's a clue that might help you there. So, hackers, yes, hackers. Okay, that's a fun one to go back and watch too. Crash Override, Acid Burn, all those special effects in it. All right, so why do we care about WinSCP now, right? This is something that's been out for forever. Well, with Windows 1809, just with a couple of PowerShell commands, you can now install an SSH server on a Windows system. So when we think about how attackers usually use RDP, what we see in a lot of cases is they will have kind of like a prepper script they will push out in the environment. So it will do things like stop the volume shadow copies. It will actually toggle some flags for Windows Firewall. It will enable terminal services so they can remote around in the environment. So now we're talking about the capability of simply just having one PowerShell command ran to install an SSH server within Windows 10. And then the next command, we're just going to start up that service. And for bonus points, if they wanted to, they could actually set that service to start up as automatic. So with just one or two or maybe three commands now, the attacker is able to easily install an SSH server on all the systems within the environment, which now means that they can use WinSCP to traverse throughout the environment instead of utilizing RDP, Windows RDP, which leaves a lot more artifacts. So something really powerful that can be done kind of natively now within the Windows operating system. And when you run this command up here, this PowerShell to install this OpenSSH server, Windows automatically does two things in the background. It automatically adds in the firewall rule, and it automatically creates a user for that SSH server. So now we're getting into a situation where it could be relatively easy to push out an SSH server onto systems throughout the entire environment, which means, now the attacker can leverage this SSH server to kind of use WinSCP to do their lateral movement throughout the environment. And they can also use WinSCP to exfiltrate out and suck that data out as well. So they kind of get this twofold, goodie package with WinSCP, data exfiltration and lateral movement within the environment. So pretty dangerous. So WinSCP artifacts, I showed you that .ini file. So what type of artifacts are we going to be able to find as forensic examiners if we're not going to have our traditional artifacts associated with RDP? So we're going to get all sorts of cool things. We're going to get some visibility into files that have been copied. Last execution, first execution, and we'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. Event logs, so I talked about, a user that was created, so we're going to see some event logs associated with login activity. User accounts, CD history, so kind of a throwback to like Linux and Unix, change directory, remote directory, systems connected to, and probably my #1 favorite thing, by utilizing something called the SHRM database, we're going to be able to get a byte count of potentially data that has traversed over the network. So let's talk about our usual suspects when it comes to WinSCP. So as you saw, I executed WinSCP on my staging system. When I do that, I get my typical artifacts that I get, with execution from a forensic standpoint. We get things like the prefetch file, which are going to give us information on, where it was executed from, first and last execution, as well as the embedded timestamps inside the prefetch file as well, up to 8 additional timestamps. Also the user assist, because this is through, like a GUI invocation, you'll get the user assist, so you're going to get the account that's associated with it, run counts, things of that nature. We get, of course, our file system information. So we get our created date and our modified date as well. So this can give us some visibility into, when was WinSCP used in the environment, when was the last time it was. And then, of course, the most important file we're going to jump into in a minute here, the WinSCP.ini file. And this is going to contain things that we would typically find in the registry right within the .ini file. Okay, and I do see some questions popping up. Oh, user assist is misspelled. Thank you very much. I will have to go back and fix that. And I see another question too. It's a bit longer, so I'll have to go back and take a look at that as we wind down. Okay, so one of the first places we're going to go look is something called the CD cache, the change directory cache. In this INI file, this configuration setting is going to give us visibility into the username that was used to connect into the system. So where this is kind of fun is, of course, this will let us know what account was compromised within our network. But if the attacker is also using it to connect into a system externally, it's kind of fun to see what username they have. I've seen, like the typical root used there, things of that nature. The IP address of systems connected to. So which systems did they, traverse to in the environment? So that's going to give us visibility into that. And then this is really cool. We're going to get the change directory history of the remote system. So what does this look like? It looks something like this. And we're going to have to do, a little bit of deobfuscation on this, if you will, to see what that looks like. So right here, I have an example, WinSCP.ini file. And right here is our CD cache with this information. So I'm going to go to one of my friends that I like to use a lot. And this is a great little utility I like to use. Now, I'm using an online version, which is typically something you are not going to want to do with sensitive data, but CyberChef. So the program I'm talking about is CyberChef. You can just Google CyberChef, take you right to this website. It's open source. You can just download it, and you can have a local copy, on your forensic workstation to work with. So you're not going to be dumping, potentially sensitive data into form out in the internet. And I'm just going to do from hex real quick. So right here, this is going to go ahead and convert this, and it's going to give me the directories. As you remember earlier, I was clicking through and browsing through all those directories on the remote system. Oh my gosh, yes, the mini disc Walkmans, right? You'd be like running along and so proud of yourself because you got the mini one that had the buffer in it and your CD wouldn't skip, right? Oh my gosh. Now we have MP3s, thank goodness, but those were the days, right? So input, anyways, we convert it and we can see our change directory right here. So this is going to give us visibility into what an attacker was doing on the remote system, kind of like our shell bags might. And I know I say shell bags funny. I apologize. I have a little bit of an accent there. So this would be kind of similar to that. We're going to get some visibility into the traversal that has been done on remote systems that have been connected into. Okay, Yahoo, all right, back in the days, Yahoo, you actually had to submit in, like, if you had a website, let's say you had a GeoCities website, right? Maybe you were selling something. You actually had to submit it to a category and a moderator would have to accept it and moderate it, the entire, category, way back when. Boy, I'm really dating myself. So here's another configuration setting, Configuration Interface Explorer. This has a couple of things, and this is more of a just like, hey, I'm just giving you a heads up on this. It doesn't seem to change. It always seems to default to the user's documents directory, and this is the variable. So if you see something like this, don't get super excited. Doesn't seem to change very much. And just here's an example of what it looks like. It has some parameters, some other interesting tidbits with it. But really the last local target directory is the one that we're looking at. But in my testing, I haven't really been able to get that to change. So it seems pretty static to say the same. However, this is a nice little one that we look at right here, the Configuration Interface Commander Local Panel. All right, we have a last path variable, and that will contain the last path browsed to on the host machine. So the machine that the attacker is running WinSCP from. Okay, it does not indicate that anything was saved. That's just, to make things great for the end user, so that the next time they start WinSCP, it's going to remember where they were at. So, if you are working a lot with different systems and you're always working out of the same directory, maybe like for me with my Raspberry Pi, I have like all of my Python scripts. So I'm always in my Python script directory. So instead of having to browse to it each time I open up WinSCP, WinSCP remembers that for me, so it drops me right back down into the same directory. So this is something to make it easier for the end user, but it does give us some visibility into what the attacker's doing. And where I have seen this before is a lot of times the attacker will have a directory with staging tools on it that they are pushing out into the environment. So, I might see something like like recon tools. I think we've seen something before like PowerShell Empire, Mimikatz. So you might find some really interesting directory names here that kind of give you visibility into what the attacker may have been accessing on the system that they were working from on that host machine. All right, so the next one here is the local target, and that is going to be the file path on the host machine. And the interesting thing here is only created if a file or folder is saved. So this is kind of where we start talking about exfiltration. When we start talking about an attacker using WinSCP on a staging system, and maybe they're pulling back data to that. This is going to happen if they save a file from one of the remote systems onto a location into WinSCP. It can also kind of go the opposite way, where we show that they are placing malware on a machine if they're connecting out externally to a machine. So if I'm an attacker and I'm using WinSCP to access, my system that's external, and I save malware down back to the active system, that could be evidence of malware. So there's this really cool website out there called the Malware Museum, where you can go and find old versions of malware. And this is kind of a fun one from back in the day. Let's see, I have a little note on here, what it's called, DOS.Walker, okay? So this is some old malware from back in the day there. Oh, okay, great question. I see a question here. What would be potential indicators of attackers were using other SSH clients? So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I didn't research specific ones, but there are some general artifacts that you can go and look for that type of information. So great question. I'll talk about that a little bit later here. Okay, so the next configuration setting, or this is an example of the local target right here. You can see that there's a list of folders that data was saved to when those files were downloaded. And kind of going back to my example here, just do a quick search for, let's see if it's in my Notepad++, my local target. I'm just going to pop into here. And I can see in the local target, if you remember when I was copying that data over, I had an exfil folder and an exfil2 folder. So, you know, this might be a situation where they might have a computer name, like, okay, the HR computer, that's where all that data is going, and this data. So they're pulling back the data. So that's going to be our local target directory where this information is saved. All right, so remote target. So this is going to be going the opposite way now. This is going to be files were uploaded to this directory from the host to the remote system. Through some testing, it seemed a little bit flaky, like I couldn't always get it to update. Sometimes it was only the first time that WinSCP was ran, and it seemed like on subsequent runs it wasn't quite updating. So this again, you know, we're forensic examiners. Sometimes we need to test things and to see how they work. It might change from version to version. So this is an example where the attacker might be copying a file up. So as you saw earlier, I took the malware file and I copied it to a system that I had compromised and was moving to laterally within the environment. So this would be our remote target. And then right here, in this particular example, it was dropped, that malware was dropped into a temp directory. All right, so this is another fun thing. Remember how I went through and I did some search terms. You know, I was looking for social security numbers. You know, maybe I'm looking for JPEG files or W-2s. You notice here there's a drop-down box where it remembers some of the search terms, or file mask, if you will. So that is going to be stored under our configuration history mask variable. And this is an example of what it looks like. So if I go back into right here and I look for my mask variable, well, let's see. And I think it actually shows up in a couple of places. Mask. I don't know why it's doing that, but it should still find it. We go right here to the mask. So you can see I have this history mask right here, and right here is, you know, the local targets that we talked about earlier. So right here, this gives me visibility into, okay, it goes towards intent, right? When we start thinking about the cases that we're working and, you know, maybe attackers are in the environment pushing out ransomware, sometimes they're just in there to push out the ransomware, get in, get out, in and out of the environment quickly. When we start seeing things like this, searches being ran for social security numbers, for tax information, things of that nature. Now we should start thinking in our heads like, okay, if they're searching for things, we need to know what would have responded positive to that. We need to know, we need to start looking for exfiltration, because why are they going to search for things and find things that respond to that unless, you know, they plan on taking it out, right? So excellent, this is great. We found some information about searches that are being ran. We know we need to start looking for exfiltration. Actually, this is excellent for us as examiners, probably not so excellent for our clients or for whoever this is happening to, right? So excellent for us, boo for, you know, whoever we're doing the work for, not so good. So the remote directory, okay, so you saw as I was running these searches, it actually will have a drop-down box that will populate out and save as we're running these searches. So we get this remote directory that we get visibility into, okay, where did they run these searches? And this is extremely helpful if you think about it, because if, for instance, I want to go back and talk to a client, I might say, okay, they were running searches for W-2s in this HR documents folder. You need to go take a look at that folder and see what would have responded positive to that, because potentially that data is at risk. So this remote directory variable is going to contain that information that is going to give us visibility into that. And here's an example of what it looks like. We have where they ran the searches. So potentially, and I haven't tested this yet to see how many out this goes. So I don't know if it contains 5, I don't know if it contains 10, 20, or 100 of these. I'm not sure when it rolls. So just something to keep in mind as you're looking through this. If you see searches that are occurring, you're going to want to go in and also look for this remote directory to see where those searches were ran from. All right, so we kind of talked about all the different places in the configuration file. And I can tell you there is probably more work that needs to be done on this. There are a lot of different settings in here. And there are some things that I haven't completed my testing on yet, different ways that you can interact with it, different ways that you can save it, different prompts that come up. So that's just kind of like a peek behind the curtains on the data that could potentially be available to you in that WinSCP.ini file. So let's talk about the timestamps and why timestamps are important to us. We need to get visibility into how many times the attacker, did I spell user assist wrong here too? May have. We need to get visibility into, did they just run this once? Did they pop on the system, they ran this, it was just there for a couple minutes, in and out, they were just pushing out their malware, case closed, that's done? Or, is this something where they ran it the first time and they were in the environment for a week and we can see them running this over and over and over again? Much, much more concerning than something that may have just ran for a matter of seconds while they pulled their malware down. So to that end, I mentioned before, we get our WinSCP.ini timestamps. Our created and our last modified timestamps are going to let us know the first time that WinSCP was ran, and then because it's updated each time it closes, we get visibility into, that time frame of, was it just ran once for a couple minutes, or was it potentially, open and running for hours and hours? Okay, so we can use the prefetch and the user assist, like I mentioned before, to get those additional times to kind of help fill out our timeline, and also how many times it ran. So timestamps are really important to us. All right, so now let's talk about some of these options of saving. All right, did anybody have one of these? The iOmega zip drives, right? It was so exciting. 100 megs that we could save, right? So much better than our little floppy disks. So if they choose at the end, you remember that little box popped up and said, hey, do you want to save the workspace? If they do click yes and save the workspace, we're going to get some additional information. So we get our host name, our username, local directory, remote directory for each workspace that is created. So they can have potentially multiple workspaces if they're connecting into different systems. They might save different workspaces. So you might have a workspace for when they connect to their external system. I'd like to think most of the attackers probably are not going to save their workspaces, but this is just something to keep in mind, a little bonus, if you will, that you might get if they do decide to go ahead and save that workspace. So right here you can see they get to save their workspace and give it a name. So, this might be like, my external system or the HR system or what have you. So you're also going to get host name right here. It was the IP address, a username, local directory, remote directory is workspace. And here's kind of the fun thing. There's actually a password. So you can see right here, I put a link to GitHub. I haven't actually tried this yet myself, but if you are in a position where you would like to crack this password or take, a stab at that, be a hacker, just like in our movie Hackers, you can go to this GitHub and give that a try as well. So let's talk about one of my favorite artifacts, the Shrum database. So the Shrum database is one of these newer artifacts that gives us visibility into bytes sent and received over network connections. It's associated with the user and application and all sorts of great information. One of the things I really haven't touched on yet, the system that I am launching WinSCP from, there could potentially be a wealth of artifacts on that system. The system that is being connected into, we are lacking artifacts. I'm going to cover a couple of them in a minute, but there are not as many artifacts connected or created on that system when WinSCP is connecting into that system. So the Shrum is actually one of those that we can take a look at on both systems that is going to give us visibility into the application. So in this particular instance of WinSCP and the bytes sent and received. So when we start thinking about data exfiltration or sucking data back from other systems, this is going to help us in both of those instances. Before we really had the SHRM, we had to rely on things like network information, and a lot of times with my clients, they just don't save that type of information. So with the SHRM, now we get visibility into that. And there are a couple of tools here, also by SANS instructors, that you can use, the SHRM Dump by Mark Baggett and SHRM Monkey by David Cowan, that will both parse this out and give you visibility into this information. So right here you can see I've got an application path right here. This is my portable WinSCP. I have a user SID that it's associated with and a byte count. So the SHRM tracks things every hour. When it's flushed, the database is flushed out, the registry flushes out the data into the database. So we can get a sense of maybe how much data was leaving the environment or coming into the environment as well by looking at the SHRM database. So on this other system, we also have byte sent. So this is on the system where WinSCP is connecting into. So right here you can see I don't have a WinSCP necessarily, but I have an application called SSHD where I have the byte sent and byte received. And there was a question earlier that was kind of talking about some artifacts, like if you're not using necessarily or you haven't installed that OpenSSHD, but something else is being used, this is a place that you can go check for it. I would expect to see a high byte count in the SHRM associated with whatever server was installed to accept that SSHD connection. Oh, and just a throwback right here, if you have your sound on, how many of you remember this sound, right? Trying to make that connection. With our old school modem, I feel like, my kids will never know the pain of having someone pick up the phone while you're on the internet, right? Mom, I'm trying to be on CompuServe. You just killed my connection. I was downloading something, right? So anyways, those were the days. Those were the days. Okay, event log. So this is one of those artifacts that we can go look at on a system that's being connected into. We're not going to get those prefetch files, the user sys with the RDP. Traditionally we might have shell bags and jump lists and link files, but you just saw that with WinSCP, I have the ability to do searching. I didn't show it, but you can actually double click on a file and open it up in an editor in WinSCP, and that's not going to create a link file on our system that's being connected into. So we have very little to kind of look at, but the event log is one place that you can go look at because, we are logging into the system. So earlier I mentioned that an account is created when you install that SSH server. And so here is the account name right here, this SSHD 1860, and an account domain of virtual users. We get a login type 5, and once again, this is our 4624 login ID associated with SSHD. So to answer someone's question, what kind of artifacts can you find if you're using a different kind of SSHD client-server connection? Go check that event log because there has to be an authentication that has to be made at some point in time. So start looking in it for something like this that might pop out. Now, it's going to vary depending on, what kind of server or client was installed. And, there could be several out there. So I'm not sure what they might populate. So if you suspect something, you can always go, do some testing and see what it will populate out in your particular event logs. So with the OpenSSH, there's actually an event log associated with that is going to give me some nice detailed information. So here I have a login from IT support, from this IP address, port, and the SSH2 right there. So I have 2 event logs that I've just shown you right here. We've got the 4624, and then one that was actually associated with the OpenSSHD, which probably will not roll as quickly as our 4624s would in an event log. Okay, so When I talk about a system that has been connected into and files have been copied back, there are very little artifacts. We talked about the SHRM, the event logs, but how could I tell what files have been copied? And something that I noticed in my testing was the access timestamps were updated on the files that have been copied. But as anybody knows with forensics, anything that has to do with an access timestamp, you want to be very, very careful. So many things on the system can change that access timestamp. An AV scan can change that, right? Just Windows updates, just all this mumbo jumbo that Windows does in the background can change those timestamps. So just because you see something like this may not necessarily mean that a bunch of files were copied. But I do want to point out that this is something that I did see in my testing. When I accessed a folder and I copied over an entire folder, it updated all these access timestamps right here. So keep that in mind, but like anything else, I cannot, stress it enough with access timestamps. Please, please, please be very, very careful. So far, most of my talk has centered on the WinSCP Portable. This is the version I believe most attackers, would be utilizing at least, smaller traces than installing the actual, executable MSI, if you will, on the system. But I did want to point out that if you do have a situation where you have WinSCP installed on the system, that is where we can go in and look at the registry for those artifacts. So let's see, I've got Registry Explorer, an awesome tool by Eric Zimmerman. This is just my ntuser.dat hive. I've popped in here. And if I go into the software key, Martin Perinkle, WinSCP2, there is a ton of information underneath here. And as you can see, there are a lot of the artifacts that we talked about, but they are now in the registry because this has been installed as a program on the system. So we talked about, the local target, remote panel, just tons and tons of information in here as well. And this is pretty much that WinSCP.ini is now holding the information that traditionally we have found in the registry associated with this particular application. Another program you can use to access that information, if you like working through command line, is you can use something like RegRipper, and you can use it with a plugin called WinSCP. So you can point it to your registry hive, specify the plugin, and it's going to parse out that data. I've done quite a bit of research on this, and I'm going to reach out to Harlan and share some of my findings to hopefully get this plugin updated so that we can include some more of this information I think that is contained in the registry that may not necessarily be in this plugin right now. But I did want to point that out, that if you like command line, you can absolutely use something like RegRipper to parse out that information to take a look at. So that brings me to the end of the presentation on WinSCP. I hope you've gotten the opportunity to see how WinSCP can be leveraged a little bit differently than how we've seen it used in the past. Traditionally, we've kind of thought about it as this mechanism might be on one or two systems where information is leaving the environment. But now with the ability to install SSH on Windows systems quickly throughout the entire environment, attackers can utilize WinSCP to do their lateral movement throughout the environment. And the artifact you really want to focus in on is that WinSCP.ini file. It's going to give you visibility into the folders that were traversed, potentially, what was accessed on the staging system, search terms that were used to search for data. So I am going to, I know my WinSC, so someone decoded that, right? Yeah, so this is what happens. I have all these VMs that I set up to do my testing, and I pop in and out of my VMs, so yes, I am guilty of just using passwords in my test VMs, but they're short-lived, and I keep it simple. when I'm doing my testing. So you do have to, give me a little bit of slack there when I'm doing all my testing in my virtual machines. So that is not my actual Windows password or anything password. It's just my testing password. So let me see. Yeah, I should have done something maybe a little bit more clever to go with the theme, but I knew I probably would have forgotten it at some point in time. So, yay. So thank you, everybody. I'm scrolling. Let me scroll through the questions. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me, Twitter, email, all of those things. Let's see. Decrypting the passwords, scrolling through the questions here. Okay, WinSCP also works from a command line. Does that leave fewer traces than using the GUI? That is a great question. I'm going to have to check that out. I mean, typically, I think we know as examiners, a lot of times when things start going to command line, we lose a lot of visibility into these artifacts. So my thought is we probably are going to lose a lot of those things, but I haven't done any testing on that. So that would be a great thing to test. Although I have found that, I think a lot of clients like to think that the attackers are super sophisticated when they get into their environment. Like, oh, this is so terrible. Please tell me they were using very sophisticated means to, get through our environment. And it's like, no, actually they weren't. They were using a bunch of GUI tools. So I think attackers like to be lazy, and lucky for us, sometimes that means the use of a lot of GUI tools that leave a lot of goodies for us. But I'm going to have to do some testing on that. That's a great question. Very important. Will the slide deck be made available to us afterwards? I don't think the slide deck will be, but there will be a recording that will be up of the presentation. I don't think we released the slide deck with that, but you can absolutely go back and check it. Maybe I'll throw up a PDF of it up on my GitHub or link, so maybe check my blog in a few days for that. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So thank you, everybody. There will be an eval link that is posted in traditional SANS. If you've ever taken a SANS course, in traditional SANS fashion, we do have an eval. My understanding is the link is super long, but the eval is pretty short. So always appreciate the feedback, good or bad, hopefully good. And once again, I want to thank everybody for your time tonight, and go out and catch them. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and sign off now.